Okay, what we're talking about now is this handy little download thing that I have for you called Exposure Dial. And what it allows you to do is to sit with your camera and with this exposure dial outside somewhere and prove to yourself that this exposure reciprocity principle actually works. And what I would like you to do is use your light meter in your camera and find what seems to be a good exposure, and pay attention to where you're aiming your camera. It's nice to aim at a blank wall or something that you can aim it at the same place every time. So let's just say that your exposure meter gives you a setting of f16 at a 1/25th of a second. It might be different, but we'll just take this for an example. Take this little dial and set it accordingly. Then you can read off the other possible combinations that will all give you an equivalent exposure to this setting. You can open your lens up one stop, and now that you're letting in twice as much light, you have to use a shutter speed that's half as long to keep the same amount of light striking the CCD collectors in your camera. If we go the other direction from f16 to f22, we're closing the lens down one stop, letting in half as much light, so we have to leave the shutter open twice as long in order to have the same amount of light striking the film or CCD. Okay, so you can sit here and you can set your camera for this and see what the meter reading inside your camera says. Then change the settings, and you're going to have to be in a manual mode with your camera to do this. Then change the settings to this, and you'll see that once again you have a good exposure. Change it to this or this or this, and this will prove to you that this principle really does work. Okay, and while we're on this topic, I want to show you a couple of other things. There's a handy thing called the rule of f16. The rule of f16 just states that on a normal sunny day between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, you can set your camera for f16 and then take the film speed and make it into a fraction. So if I had my camera set for, let's say, a film speed of 100, an ASA of 100, I make that into a fraction. That's 1 over 100. Now there actually isn't a setting like that, so this is the closest one. And all it means is that on a sunny day, in the middle of the day, f16 and the film speed made into a fraction for your shutter speed gives you pretty close to a good exposure. It's just a little magic rule that works pretty well just in case you didn't have a light meter available or your meter in your camera for some reason was not working. Okay, now there's another thing that happens is if we get to too long of an exposure time, we have to be careful about camera movement. So there's a camera shake rule as well. And what that is to take the focal length of your lens and make that into a fraction. For example, if you had a 50 millimeter lens, which is a pretty common focal length, or if you had a zoom lens that was zoomed to about 50 millimeters, make that into a fraction, 1/50th. Then we go to the next longest shutter speed, which in this case would be a 30th of a second. And at 1/30th of a second or longer, you need to start being careful that you don't have camera movement. And that's possibly time for a tripod. You can maximize your ability to shoot long exposures handheld by just being very careful. Put your feet at about shoulder distance apart, possibly bend your knees slightly. Cradle your camera with your left hand under the lens and your right hand on the shutter button. Bring your elbows in close. Take a breath and hold it and gently squeeze the shutter. A lot of people are able to shoot all the way down to 1/8 of a second or 1/4 of a second in a lot of situations. The main thing to remember is if we had a 200 millimeter lens, a telephoto lens, all of a sudden this number becomes a 200th of a second. Okay, so at a 1/25th of a second you have to start being careful with a telephoto lens. And that seems obvious because we've all looked through binoculars and you know the little bit of movement. If you're at a football game with binoculars and the crowd is roaring and the bleachers are going up and down, you know how much that moves. So these are just two handy rules, a handy little dial to keep with you while you're learning how these aperture and shutter speed relationships work.